Our next speaker needs little introduction to those of us at Northeast Georgia Health System. Dr. Michael Appel joined our organization in 2008. He's a board-certified anesthesiologist, and he is our Chief Patient Safety Officer. He also, in his past, he has 20 years of healthcare experience and is a former Delta pilot and brings his knowledge and expertise in aviation to our safety journey as we go along with this journey. He's just remarkable in terms of his passion, his commitment to no harm for our patients, a very achievable goal for us as we go forward. He also is an accomplished speaker, author, and safety consultant. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Appel.
Thanks, that was very nice. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be here and be a part of this. Let's hear for the organization of this conference. It's just incredible. The people who put this together. And it's our second annual. Does that mean we can officially call last year our first annual? Because we weren't allowed to. That was presumptive. So it was just our first. But this is an annual event, and it's grown beyond our wildest imagination. It's really tough to follow both of these speakers. They did a fantastic job. In fact, I'm going to try to weave some of their themes into what I've prepared for you. One of the things that jumped out at me when Anthony was discussing energy control as a way of conceptualizing safety, I came across that in industry. It's used a lot as a way of conceptualizing how to keep people safe. Control electricity, control 50,000 volts. In our industry, we could really apply that very same thing if we think about energy. What kind of things do we handle that have energy, that can harm people? Chemicals, drugs, right? Radiation, knives, magnets. So we're handling those very dangerous materials and substances every day, and when we mishandle them and we fail to control them, that's what leads to harm. So extremely relevant. I think it was the work of Haddon. The other thing about it is the barriers that exist. How many of you are walking around with an IV that I could immediately give you a fatal dose of a chemical? You have barriers built in, your skin, your vessels. But all of our patients pretty much have an IV, which is a shortcut to their vascular system. So one of their barriers, just by virtue of being a patient, is broken. Just by being a patient, they are that one step closer to catastrophe. So keep that in mind, and it's a very valuable way of thinking about safety. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about crew resource management. So my goal today is to go over what it is. To illustrate why it was developed, I'm going to use an airplane crash, of course, as the basis for a discussion. But looking at it like Carol Ann looked at the unfortunate death of her daughter, Leanne, looking at it retrospectively through the lens of what we now know could have prevented it. And in fact, the tools that could have prevented the Tenerife crash were developed as a result of the Tenerife crash and are now used to make aviation as safe as it could possibly be. So that's what we're going to do. And then finally, I'm going to tie those concepts directly to our air prevention tools. Do you know why? Because crew resource management and air prevention tools are the same thing. The same thing. Okay. No one's paying me to say anything. This is for CRM purposes, continuing education purposes. And having a little trouble with the clicker. Can you advance the slide for me, please? There we go. The objectives. Okay. Could you advance the slide? All right. So what is CRM? So On March 27th, 1977, CRM was born. And it was born because on that date there was a devastating plane crash in Tenerife that killed 583 people. Now, 1977 was 3 years before one of the vertical lines on one of Craig's slides that showed that before 1980, what did we think of when we thought of safety? We thought of technology, mechanics. And then in 1980, we got a little bit more hip to the fact that, wait a second, standardization, procedures, training, that's the answer once we took care of technology. So the graph goes somewhat like this as we get safer from technology. Then we hit the part of the graph for safety improvements where procedures, training, standardization take place. And then we get to that really long tail of the graph, which is all about error trapping. That's what Craig calls it, error trapping, which is exactly what error prevention tools are all about, error trapping. So back in 1977, they were still stuck in the mechanical phase of the analysis of airplane crashes. However, most of the mechanical reasons for airplane crashes had already been fixed. So in 1977, engine failure was a thing of the past, pretty much, and crews were trained, and there were standards, that if an engine did quit, even at the worst possible time during takeoff, the plane could fly away from the runway safely. The prototype disaster during the early days of aviation was an engine failure on takeoff at the worst possible time. That was the big worry. They took care of that. But when planes continued to crash after the 70s, it uncovered the new causes of crashes, which was, anybody? Human error, lack of training, standardization, and change one of the words of human error, and that's something that's commonly used, particularly in the media, to describe a plane crash. It's due to pilot error, right, pilot error, human error. So what's pilot error? What does that mean, pilot error? What is it supposed to mean? What does it mean to you? What do you think it means to most people when they hear pilot error? They didn't follow protocol. Pilot error technically has only one meaning, really, a lack of mechanical failure. Anytime a plane crashes and it's not due to mechanical failure, that was not meant as a joke. I'm not as good as Craig, but I'm getting there. We call it pilot error, but that's a misnomer, isn't it? Because what does it sound like when we say pilot error? We're blaming somebody. We're blaming the pilot. Who should we blame? What should we blame? The system in which the error occurred. The system that allowed, maybe even take it one step further, provoked an error. And that's what pilot error is all about. Not well understood by most people when they hear that. And here's why it's so dangerous to misinterpret what pilot error means. We all immediately would say, I'd never do that. And the pilot's dead. So then what are the chances of that same accident ever happening again? 0. So what do we have to do about it? Nothing. In fact, you'll see from this Tenerife crash, there's a lot of coincidences and a lot of things that all of us would probably say, I would never do something that stupid. Just like when we investigate medical errors, we all tend to think, I would never do something that stupid. The fact is, these are normal people. It's just another day on the job. And they're in a situation, in an environment, in a system that allows these errors to happen without being trapped. That's what CRM, which stands for Crew Resource Management, is all about. So, okay, so then this is a healthcare safety conference. Why are we talking about plane crashes? Shouldn't I be analyzing medical mishaps? Wouldn't that be a little bit more direct, effective? I mean, here's the reason why plane crashes, particularly the Tenerife crash, is extremely valuable to us. For one thing, the investigations are extremely thorough. 200 pages of report. No stone is left unturned. We know exactly what happened, down to the supercritical analysis of subtleties. That's one reason. It doesn't really happen in healthcare, those types of investigations. We never really know. We don't have cockpit voice recorders, flight data recorders, records at the same level as aviation. The other thing is, the causes of human error that cause airplane crashes aren't just similar to healthcare, they are identical. So as we go through this, maybe some of these things will jump out at you as extremely relevant to your work, even though it's a completely different industry. But maybe the most important thing about the Tenerife crash is it's considered a prototype for organizational vulnerability. It is an example of an industry, a snapshot of an industry in 1977, which is in a lot of ways a snapshot of our industry today. So the Tenerife crash might never again happen, or even come close to happening again in aviation, but those very same vulnerabilities exist in our industry today, because we're still not yet in the error-trapping phase of accident prevention. So before I go into too much detail about what CRM actually is, I know you're all dying to know, let me just tell you that it's a subset of human factors engineering. So you're probably thinking, well, what's human factors engineering? And everyone has an idea what it is. I asked someone about human factors, and they said, oh yeah, Debbie Weber's in charge of that department. What is human factors? I think we all know it better than we think we do. What human factors, a good synonym for human factors is ergonomics. And we all kind of have an idea what ergonomics means. We might not always relate it to human factors. But the reason is because the way, you got a different one? Thank you. The reason we misunderstand ergonomics is because the way it's used in common English. We think of it as physical issues, like a chair that offers good back support, or a mouse that supports your wrist. Ergonomics, physical. So what human factors is the study of the capabilities and limitations of human design. That's what it is. And it encompasses psychology, engineering, a lot of disciplines. But it's the capabilities and limitations of human design. So the way ergonomics is used addresses physical human design. Human factors includes, and so does ergonomics, technically they're synonyms, but in the way human factors is often used, it includes cognitive human design. And in fact, that's most of what human factors is, particularly in industries such as ours, where most of what we do is not physical, it is cognitive, mental. So that's what human factors is. Ergonomics for the brain, think of it in that way. Cognitive ergonomics. How humans interact within a system and with each other. That's a synonym of a technical term called the socio-technical system in which we work. How we work among ourselves, with each other, and within the system that we function. And the goal of human factors engineering is to optimize our performance as individuals and also the system in which we work. And in healthcare, optimal system performance means, it's the first thing, the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. So now we can start to get into what CRM actually is and does for people like us who work in a hazardous environment. So the U.S. Navy defines it. By the way, everyone in the U.S. Navy gets weeks of training in crew resource management. Use all available resources to increase operational mission effectiveness. What are resources? Teamwork is a resource. The term resource might conjure up images of things that are material or physical, but really what it means is the resources that come from our cognitive abilities and the way that we work with one another. So that's a great definition of it. So another definition of CRM is a system of behavior modifications. That sounds a little Orwellian, doesn't it? Minimize crew errors, maximize crew coordination, manage risk in real time. But why do we have to modify our behaviors? What's wrong with us? Sorry? We don't know everything. And how are we built as human beings? Are we perfect? Do we get carpal tunnel if we do this 1,000 times, right? Do we get back pain if we sit in a chair that doesn't have good back support, right? So what other things cognitively do we do that might make us suboptimal, that might need modification? We make mistakes. We commit errors, lots of errors. So that's where CRM helps us. And real time. Don't underestimate the value of real time. Real time. Things happen quickly and dynamically in our work. We have to be able to trap those errors right away. So I mentioned the Hippocratic Oath. Just about any paper on patient safety seems to start with, back in 1999, the Institute of Medicine issued a report to Err is Human, right? And in the upper left corner of the book cover, it actually says, first do no harm. So that's part of the Hippocratic Oath, right? Hippocrates said this, right? Hippocrates was Greek, and this is Latin. Nice try. First, do no harm. The most obvious tenet of our industry. It should always be first and foremost in our mind. A couple other Latin expressions that I took liberty writing is this one. Hoc planum frugosus. It means don't crash the plane. So if we had to think of a Hippocratic Oath for aviation, maybe this would be it, right? Right? And then I also made this one up. It's fun playing with Google Translate, by the way. It's a blast. Noli oblivici principis. It means don't forget the basics. Don't forget the basics. So what's basic about our industry? What's basic? Keeping people from dying from sepsis, managing diabetes, preventing people from falling, especially after they come in, they might be dehydrated, orthostatic. We give them drugs that interfere with their balance and consciousness. These are the basics. These are things that are often overlooked because we're distracted with other job concerns. Maybe Latin will help us take it a little more seriously. 2 weeks ago, I gave a very similar presentation to the trauma symposium. And I remember this mnemonic from my internship years when I worked in the emergency room. This is the hierarchy of issues that need to be addressed in a trauma patient, in this order. And it starts with airway. So airway is the most important thing, but if you overlook the basics, like instead of managing a blood sugar of 427 in a patient, you're charting. If at a trauma scene, you're worried about a dramatic bloody scalp wound in a patient who's not breathing or has an airway obstructed, your priorities are wrong. A patient could have a very dramatic ankle fracture that's taking all the attention away from the fact that they're hypotensive or their airway's obstructed. So very practical way of addressing the trauma patient. Back when I flew, we had a priority as well, and we used this mnemonic, and by the way, any resemblance to an actual airline is purely coincidental. So, don't crash the plane. Don't forget the basics. So how do we keep an eye on what's important? That's where CRM comes in. So CRM, I wrote born in the sky, but actually it was born on the ground because the two 747s collided on the runway, not in the air. At the time, in 1977, the 747 had been flying for about 8 years, so it was still the queen of the sky. It was very glamorous to be a pilot for a 747, to be a passenger on a 747. It was the ultimate. Consider that aviation mishaps are typically due to human error. However, back in 1977, we were just starting to understand this. Now, looking back, it's obvious. But back then, the first question was what failed, what quit, what broke when a plane would go down. So technology has developed over the last, say, 100 years at a blistering pace to improve safety. However, we as human beings are essentially the same as we were during caveman times. So our brains are not adapted. Like Anthony said, our eyes are adapted for walking, not for driving, not for moving 60 miles an hour, certainly not for moving 150 miles an hour. And our brains are not adapted for the types of mental processing we need to do as healthcare workers. So some of our ingrained behaviors that were well adapted back when we were walking through the woods worried about a saber-toothed tiger pouncing on us are actually maladapted for today's world, and that's what gets us into trouble. So CRM is really behavior modifications away from what we normally just do because of the way we're designed as humans, and refine that behavior to enable us to function in a modern, very hazardous, and very complex world. So look, aviation mishaps, the leading cause of aviation mishaps is also the leading cause of patient harm. So what do we have to modify then? So this is what CRM is all about, modifying some of our innate behavioral tendencies so that we're less likely to make errors. So there are three things that we don't do very well as humans that if we made deliberate attempts at improving our behavior in these realms, we will be much safer. Assertiveness, communication, and situational awareness. I'll go over each of these in detail so we can understand it better. By the way, these are all concepts built right into error prevention tools. So assertiveness, Craig said, what kind of pebbles? Shy pebbles, right? There's a lot of shy pebbles. We need to be more assertive than we're designed to be, so it takes effort to do that. Here's a fantastic definition of assertiveness and how it applies to safety. The willingness to actively participate, state and maintain a position until convinced by the facts that other options are better. So it requires participation, and it requires a position. In order to have a position, you need critical thinking. So you're not just a passive participant, you're an active participant. And then assertiveness is not complete until the loop is closed. That's the last part of it. Convinced by the facts that other options are better. So the first officer of the KLM jet had a feeling that Pan Am was still on the runway. A pretty strong feeling, and he said that. But he didn't assert himself strongly enough until he was convinced by the facts that in fact Pan Am was still on the runway. We're looking back at that event through what we now know was a key ingredient of the disaster. Communication. Why are we so terrible at communication? In our modern world, communication takes a much larger role than it did back when we were cavemen. Lots of critical information, lots of room for error, lots of potential consequences of error from communication. Great definition, the ability to clearly and accurately send and acknowledge, send and receive information, instructions, commands, and provide useful feedback. So communication we normally think of as the speaker, when in fact communication is just as much the responsibility of the listener. That's where three-way readback comes in. Situational awareness. This one's a little tricky because it's a fancy phrase, but doesn't necessarily give you a good sense of what it means without some explanation. A great way to think about situational awareness is fill in the blank sentence. If we don't blank, then blank is going to happen. Situational awareness is a thorough understanding of a complex situation. So we have a good idea of where we've been, what's happening now, and what's likely to happen next. Situational awareness. If we don't treat the blood sugar, the patient might go into DKA. If we don't suspect sepsis, the patient with hypotension, tachycardia, and a fever might die from sepsis. Situational awareness. Now look, all of these three elements of human behavior are not equal in crew resource management. Situational awareness is the master because it's what drives the communication and what drives assertiveness. So without situational awareness, you're never going to get to the communication or the assertiveness. So The patient with tachycardia, hypotension, and a fever has sepsis until proven otherwise. Well, then you need to communicate that, and you need to be assertive and persist until convinced by the facts that doing nothing is a better idea. So now we're going to look back on the crash, knowing what we know about situational awareness. Also, another thing that is really important in understanding this crash is that if I just told you the story, you would think, how could that captain have done what he did? How could he have been so reckless? And it really does stir up some anger that 583 people died as a result of this performance. But looking back on it, I want you to see what the other participants did and think, what could they have done differently had they been trained, maybe, that could have prevented the accident. So 583 deaths in an instant, 52 children. Two very massive modern airplanes collided on the ground, and it prompted the development of what is now known as CRM, and by 1990, crew resource management was a global standard for flight crews. So it took about 13 years until it finally became a global standard. Nothing happened quickly. Also, as we go through this, I want you to consider the following factors which degrade human performance. Now, back in 1977, these were not obvious, and they were not considered as important as they are today in what might have caused that accident. Now, if you look at this list, there's only one that doesn't apply to us: weather. Weather. All the others apply directly to our daily work. And as we go through the accident story, consider what each of these things, and I'll keep this list going through some of the subsequent slides to help you refer to what jumps out on this list as key factors in the accident. So Tenerife is in the Canary Islands. So here's Africa, and there's the Canary Islands. It's a state of the country of Spain. It's like their Hawaii. It's one of their states. It's a beautiful resort that is very popular among Europeans. So here's a larger diagram of the Canary Islands. Now, the main destination is Las Palmas, Gran Canary Island. So there were two 747s bound for Las Palmas that day. KLM from Amsterdam, and Pan Am was coming from Los Angeles with a stop in JFK in New York. They were both charters. As they approached Las Palmas, a terrorist bomb went off at the flower shop of the Las Palmas airport, the main airport in the Canary Islands. Canary Island separatists, people who I guess wanted to be separated from Spain. It was a small bomb, didn't have major consequences as far as its effect on the airport or injuries. But what happened is, since both planes were inbound to that airport, they were diverted to Tenerife, which is another island, very, very close. So both of these airplanes landed at their unintended airport full of passengers and with people who really wanted to get to Las Palmas. What happened there? Okay, so a KLM, by the way, these are the actual planes that crashed. I dug up these pictures. KLM 747, Pan Am 747. This was the first plane to enter commercial service, by the way, the first 747. Serial number 1. Now, this is the captain of the KLM jet. His name was Jacob von Zanten. Now, he wasn't just any captain. He was the head of training for KLM. Head of training. So why is that important? What goes through your mind when you think of that? Highly experienced? Knowledgeable? Authority. Ooh, there we go. So these are some things that might have had negative impact on people's interactions. Authority. Also, this is overlooked in a lot of analyses, but it probably played a very big role. He spent most of his life in a simulator. He rarely flew the line. He picked up this trip because it was just quick out and back. Amsterdam, Canary Islands, and back. I'm home, in my own bed tonight. Pilots don't really like overnights. If you could do a day trip every day, that's the dream come true for a pilot. So he picked up the trip just to get his 1 or 2 days in the actual airplane, but most of his time he spent in the simulator. We'll see later how that might have impacted what happened. So not only was he the head of training and a very handsome man, but he made his way into the centerfold of the magazine that was on the plane when it crashed. This is an ad for KLM from that picture. So this is the airport in Tenerife. Now it's a very, very long runway. I think it's 12,000 feet, long enough for a 747. But it's a little narrower than usual, and it had no facilities to handle a large passenger jet. It was good to get the wheels on the ground, and that was about it. So when all these other airplanes inbound for Gran Canaria ended up on the ground here, it was gridlock, congestion. They didn't know how long it was going to take for the airport to open again, where they could just get off the ground and go to their original destination. So KLM, the captain, he decided for the convenience of the passengers to let them off the airplane, stretch their legs, walk around. And look where they parked. You can't really see it from the picture well, but here's where the exit of the end of the runway. There's a taxiway here. They had a park there. And this is how the planes were arranged. And this is KLM, and this is Pan Am, right here. And this is what it looked like. This is a photo from the actual day of the accident. So KLM is parked here, Pan Am is parked here. Pan Am decided, hey, so we can get off the ground real quick, let's keep the passengers on. However, when the main airport finally opened, they couldn't leave because they were blocked. So they sat there for a while. As time's going by, Captain von Zanten started to realize, wait a second, we got these duty regulations. And the Dutch government recently passed a law limiting flight duty times for flight crews. And it was quite a draconian law, punishable by loss of license, fines, or even jail time if it was violated. So he was worried about that. He's like, I got to get off the ground as quickly as possible so we can get our passengers to Gran Canaria and then we can get back to Amsterdam. And as time got really into a bit of a crunch, he decided to take on more fuel so that he didn't have to fuel up in Gran Canaria. So he could just let the passengers off and immediately depart for Amsterdam. This is the runway configuration right here. And when it was time for them to leave, they were parked here. KLM had to go first because he was blocking Pan Am. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and guess what just happened to happen? This volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean all of a sudden had fog. So fog shrouded the runway, so the control tower couldn't see any airplanes, and each airplane could not see each other. So over the radio, KLM was instructed to back taxi on the runway. So they were going to use this runway taking off in this direction. Back taxi along the runway, turn around here, and wait for instructions to take off. While KLM is back taxiing, they also instructed Pan Am to back taxi, but to take the third exit on the left to get out of the way so KLM could take off. So with that as background, a lot of what we know about this accident is based on what was said in the cockpit. So here's what the cockpit voice recorder reveals about, and I want you to not only look at the words, but try to immerse yourselves in the reality of the actors. What were they thinking? Pan Am transmits on the radio, Tenerife, the Clipper 1736 instructed to contact you and taxi down the runway. Is that correct? And then the tower controller says, affirmative, taxi into the runway and leave the runway third to your left. Into the runway. This was not a native English speaker. The tower control in Tenerife was trying to speak English. His native language was Spanish. He could tell a little bit because of the non-standard use of words. But also, it seems that Pan Am might have had trouble understanding these printed words because then what happens is Pan Am says, third to the left. Okay, the flight engineer in the Pan Am cockpit says, third, he said. Another crew member says, 3. Tower says, third, 1 to your left. The captain says, I think he said first. Pan Am co-pilot says, I'll ask him again. Okay, so this wasn't a major event, except that it pointed out that there were some language issues and some communication issues and subsequent confusion. At the end of the runway, the KLM jet reached the end of the runway, had to turn around and take off in the other direction. I just want to point out to you that it takes, according to the manual of the 747, 142 feet width to make a 180. That assumes that the tires on one side of the airplane are right at the edge of the pavement and the wheel is turned all the way. And then it takes 142 feet diameter of a curve to turn around a 747. The runway was 150 feet wide. The analysis of that, this captain was thinking about nothing else while turning around the jet, except not running off the runway into the grass or the mud. He had 8 feet. I can't even park within 2 feet of the curb. Try turning around a 747 with 8 feet to spare on either side of the runway. So the captain's turning around the jet. As soon as he straightens out the jet, he starts to advance the throttles for takeoff. Not only had they not even received takeoff clearance, they hadn't even received a air traffic clearance, which is once they take off, what are they going to do? Where are they going to steer? What altitude are they going to fly? They hadn't received any of that. So the captain advances the throttles a little bit, and the co-pilot says, wait a minute, we don't have an ATC clearance. And then the captain says, no, I know that. Go ahead, ask. No, I know that. You really know that? KLM gets on the radio and says, we're waiting for our ATC clearance. The details of this aren't so important, except this is the ATC clearance. However, this is only a clearance once they're airborne. This is what altitude they're going to fly at, what heading they're going to take, and what radio beacon they're going to aim for. But it is not a clearance to take off. So look at the very end of this. KLM is reading back the clearance and says, right turn out until 040 until intercepting the 325, and as he's saying this, the captain again is advancing the throttles. This guy's in a rush. He is in a rush. So what does the first officer do? He says on the radio, we are now at takeoff. We are now at takeoff. What does that mean? What did it mean to him? What do you think it meant to the investigators who heard this not knowing anything else? Not that they were taking off. The Dutch, Spanish, and American investigators all did not believe that this meant we're taking off. This was non-standard phraseology. We're at takeoff. Could it have been a stressed out Dutch speaker trying to speak English? Could it have been a cry for help? He knew they didn't have clearance. But instead of influencing the captain's decision to take off, he just announced, this is what we're doing. But nobody interpreted it as we're taking off. So it's foggy. Pan Am's still on the runway taxiing back. By the way, missed the third turnoff. They were still on the runway because they missed the third turnoff because they couldn't see it in the fog. And then the captain, as he's advancing the throttle, says, "We gaan," which means, here we go, in Dutch. As soon as KLM begins its takeoff roll, so by the way, no one understands we are now at takeoff, meaning KLM is rolling. But here's another big blunder. The tower says to KLM, stand by for takeoff, I will call you. At the same time, Pan Am says, we're still taxiing down the runway. However, since both of these transmissions were at the exact same time, the only thing that played over the speaker in the KLM cockpit was a squeal from interference from two simultaneous radio transmissions. How freaky is that? A few seconds on either side, either one of these transmissions might have been the deal breaker, right? But yet there was another chance to prevent the accident. Look at this. 10 seconds after the start of KLM's takeoff roll, tower says to Pan Am, report runway clear. Pan Am says, okay, we'll report when we're clear. Tower says, thank you. All of these transmissions were heard clearly in the cockpit of KLM. Clearly. And what happened? The flight engineer, the third pilot in the KLM cockpit, says, "Is he not clear then?" The captain says, "What did you say?" The flight engineer, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" And the captain says, "Oh, yes." And then right out of the accident report, oh, I'm sorry. There it is. Right out of the accident report, look at this. Perhaps because of the captain's prestige making it difficult to imagine an error of this magnitude, both the co-pilot and the flight engineer made no further objections. Impact occurred 13 seconds later. And it's also observed that at the time for takeoff approach, the captain, perhaps on account of distractions, seemed a little absent from all that was heard in the cockpit. It's almost like he didn't hear anything on the radio, was not present for the conversations. He missed the radio transmissions. He missed, his mental model was all jacked up. And the other pilots who had an accurate mental model did not have the tools to be able to escalate in time to change the outcome. So this is what the collision looked like in animation. This is from the point of view of behind Pan Am. KLM is coming right out in the fog, just maybe a few seconds away from taking the fourth turnoff because they had missed the third turnoff due to the fog. This is what the collision looked like from one point of view. And this is the picture that Craig included in his presentation. To quote the understatement of the century, obviously a major malfunction. Flaming wreckage of the Pan Am jet with startled passengers. 61 people survived, only those who were on the Pan Am jet. Everyone on KLM perished. And the next day, this is an aerial view. It's hard to see, but that's Pan Am, and that's KLM. So what caused this crash? Pilot error, right. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Who's at fault? A lot of things. A lot of errors. And the system was not designed to be able to trap those errors. That's what I say is a reasonable conclusion that could be drawn from this. So look at this. This is from the accident report. The KLM captain's decision to take off in the mistaken belief that a takeoff clearance from air traffic control had been issued. So remember situational awareness, communication, assertiveness. What jumps out at you from this one sentence that encompasses all three of those concepts? Captain's decision, the mistaken belief, takeoff clearance. There you have it. Situational awareness, assertiveness. So when we say failure of assertiveness, who are we pointing our fingers at? The other two pilots, right? So right there, building blocks of CRM, exactly where we need to plug CRM into these types of situations to make sure that these types of accidents are, can never happen. So the book Managing the Unexpected, which Craig mentioned, is perhaps the first book you should read if you're interested in understanding high reliability organizing and high reliability organizations. The author, Carl Weick, also analyzed this crash. And in fact, I stole that list of issues that impact safety from this paper. So all of these things he called out as building blocks, as ingredients of this disaster. And remember, with the exception of weather, they all apply to us as well. So Captain von Zanten was under stress, and the stress degraded his cognitive performance. He probably only had one thing on his mind right then: getting off the ground, getting back to Amsterdam so he wouldn't lose his pilot's license because of those rules, which is kind of ironic because those rules were put in place for safety. And look what happened as an unintended consequences of duty limits. He had tunnel vision, which in technical terms can be referred to as cognitive narrowing. And Carl Weick also cited a concept known as regression to first learned response. I'll go over that in a minute. All right, loss of breakdown of coordination. Regression to first learned response. When you are in a situation of stress, you regress to that which you are most comfortable with, that behavior that might have been part of your arsenal for the longest time. And consider that Captain von Zanten was a training captain and spent most of his life in a simulator. Now, the thing about a simulator is the training captain sits in a seat behind the other two pilots and gives them commands and acts as air traffic control and tells them what to do and sets up the training scenario. In other words, the training captain in normal everyday life acts as air traffic control. So Carl Weick theorizes that in his mind, he was giving himself clearance to take off, because under that stress, he was regressing to his first learned response. The other reason why this is a really important concept is because we're going through a lot of stress right now in our organization, right? I would say EPIC's rattling us to the core. And so let me just back up a minute. Don't these things kind of jump out at you now as some of the effects of transition to a new... By the way, I love EPIC. It's fantastic. Once we learn it, we will get the most value out of it. However, for now, look at all this stuff, right? So we're being rattled to our core, and we're stressed out, kind of like Captain von Zanten. But if you look at that regression to first learned response, this is why error prevention tools need to be habit. Because when we're most stressed and when we're most likely to create errors is when we need them the most, and if they're not habit, forget about it. We are going to regress to what we're comfortable with the old way before we had error prevention tools. We want to regress to our error prevention tools. So given the known impact of stress on human performance, I want to ask you this question. Was Captain Jacob von Zanten's behavior normal? Was it normal, what he did? What am I really asking when I ask that question? You read my mind. The substitution test. That's what Becca just said. The substitution test. Would a normal, similar person in the same circumstances have done the same thing? And whether you agree or not, it is the premise of the practice of modern safety management that yes, the reason von Zanten did what he did is because that's what people do when those unique sets of circumstances all happen to come together. And if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't have done anything about the conditions that were in place that day. But the fact that we did address these conditions in detail over about 40 years is why we have such incredible safety in air travel. One thing worth calling out, and we're almost wrapping it up here, is this accident was freaky, right? There were so many things that if only each of those things hadn't happened, any one of those wouldn't have happened, the accident wouldn't have happened. There wasn't a bomb. If there was no fog, if there was no squeal from the simultaneous transmissions, if Pan Am hadn't missed the third turnoff, right? If KLM hadn't taken on lots of fuel, they probably would have gotten off the ground sooner. I mean, they took a lot of fuel. Fuel makes up about 40% of the weight of an aircraft if the tanks are full. 40%. So a plane with very little fuel, they were just hopping over to Las Palmas. They didn't need to go back to Amsterdam. But he decided to tanker fuel to Las Palmas so he could, without delay, go all the way back to Northern Europe. So lots of fuel. The takeoff roll would have been about 2,000 feet shorter had he not taken that fuel. It wouldn't have happened. He would have flown over Pan Am at a low altitude. It would have been what we call a near miss, right? We might never have even analyzed the accident to this level of detail. So in a way, it was a gift, if I dare say. Also, if he hadn't taken on fuel, even if the accident did happen, there would have been more survivors on the KLM jet, because what killed them was not breakup of the airplane, but fire. If KLM hadn't blocked Pan Am, Pan Am was ready to leave an hour before KLM, but they couldn't get out. They would have been out of there. There would have been only one 747 trying to take off. What if Captain Von Santen was just a regular pilot or a more timid pilot and it wasn't the head of training? But with all these what ifs, we could hide behind any of them. We can hide behind the freakiness of any accident. What high reliability organizations do is they don't rely on the unlikely coincidences, but they fix it anyway. Because if any of these things wouldn't have happened, any one thing, pick one of these things, all those other conditions that we discussed would still have remained. And those are the holes in the Swiss cheese that on another day would have possibly contributed to an accident. So a system that depends on the freakiness and the unlikeliness of catastrophes is a vulnerable system. And the antonym of vulnerable is resilient. So we need to not rely on the fact that these things are super rare, but we need to be so resilient that when all these things happen to come together by chance on one day, it still does not lead to catastrophe. So in summary, I just want to tie this into our toolkit, because remember before I made the bold statement saying that CRM, crew resource management, is error prevention tools. Let me show you how. So you're familiar with these. So I've just taken the list. All right. It'll probably be hard to read, especially since I try to get fancy with the colors. Communicate clearly, you know that tool. It takes situational awareness of risk in order for us to feel compelled to use what might be awkward, the phonetic alphabet, a read back. We're not used to it, so it feels awkward. What drives us to do it? Situational awareness of the risk of miscommunication. And then assertiveness. To ask a clarifying question, you have to be assertive. To request a three-way readback when someone doesn't give it to you requires assertiveness. Hey, can I get that three-way readback from you? Handoffs. And the purpose of an S-bar, a handoff, is to create situational awareness in somebody else. I get it. I've been here 12 hours taking care of this really sick ICU patient. Time for me to go home. But you know what? I'm going to give a really good handoff so that this next person who comes on has really good situational awareness. So I'm going to package it and transfer it to them to the best of my ability. Act with a questioning attitude. If it just said questioning attitude, we could walk around thinking critically all day. But unless we act on that critical thinking, there's the loss of assertiveness right there. It's all in our head until we act on it, until we speak up. That's assertiveness. Maintaining your wingman, a proper double check requires the situational awareness that it's necessary in the first place. Requires a little bit of a self-awareness of the vulnerability to making those 1 in 1,000 mistakes. And that assertiveness to ensure proper participation. Hey, can you do that double check with me? Don't just co-sign what I wrote. I want you to do the calculation on your own because I'm afraid I might not have done it correctly. There's assertiveness there. Pay attention to detail. CRM, crew resource management. STAR is a tool for a crew of one. It's something you do all by yourself. It's CRM in your brain. Stop, think, act, review. I'm watching my own back. And lastly, speak up for safety. Not only is this one of my favorites because it's so complex, the assertiveness that's driven by a situational awareness of an impending disaster is exactly what would have saved KLM Pan Am disaster. They only had 23 seconds from the start of takeoff roll until 583 people died. So that flight engineer and co-pilot had a time limit to get through to the head of this captain who was so convinced that the runway was clear and that he was doing the right thing. So if we would analyze what Captain Von Santen did through just culture, we would not consider him culpable. So ARCC would have saved the day. And in fact, the briefings and the way we're taught to escalate in the cockpit were developed as a direct result of this crash. And we're required to actually act them out in the simulator. Okay, so we're wrapping it up here. Just remember, it's about coordination to meet our collective mission, which is first, do no harm and prevent catastrophe. Error prevention tool and CRM are the same thing. Human error is normal behavior. It's the way normal people behave in the unique, complex situations that we find ourselves in. And as a result of being human, we need tools, we need modifications to that behavior to be safer than we would ordinarily be. And the reason why it must become habit is so that in times of stress, a day like Tenerife, where there's a bomb and fog and a rush and duty limits and I missed the turnoff, we're resilient enough that our first learned response is to be as safe as we possibly can. And I'll leave you with this quote from Aristotle. Greek, not Latin, right? Okay. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.